people will put things no matter where they can put them. If they haven't got enough storage space in the original design, if that's value engineered down to a smaller space, that will then impact how the area is used. First question I always ask for any project is, how is the area going to be used and who's going to be there? If you can map that around your design and your building services layout around those two questions, then you'll probably end up with a compliant space rather than going, well, these are the regulations and this is what we have to build it to. That's fine, but we need to consider who's going to go in there and what the impact of that will be longer term, I suppose.
Infection stops where information starts. Welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast, where knowledge is your strongest defense. Broadcasting from the front lines of healthcare, we dive into the strategies, science, and stories shaping infection prevention today. Each episode, we connect you with experts on real-world insights to help you stop the spread of healthcare-associated infections, protect patients, and strengthen your practices as an infection prevention and public health expert. When the right information reaches the right people, lives are saved.
Hello and welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast. My name is Garrett Hollenbeek, Editor-in-Chief of Transmission Control. Today we're talking about whether our built environments, and that's a term we'll get into in more detail, are built to keep patients safe. And that's going to touch on construction management, planning, renovation, and making sure that everything from water to air to the way we have these things set up from the outset impacts the safety of our patients. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsors.
Brought to you from the studios of Healthcare HQ, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Hello and welcome to Season 4 of the Transmission Control Podcast. My name is Garrett Hollenbeek, Editor-in-Chief of Transmission Control, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Jill Holdsworth. Jill, how are you?
Hey, Garrett. I'm doing great. Happy to be here as always.
Yeah, this is an exciting episode because it is touching on something that impacts all patients, anybody who comes into the facility. It can be kind of a nightmare for IPs to handle. Are we built to heal? We're going to be talking about infrastructure, construction, water safety, and we brought on an expert, Alyson Prince, built environment and infection control specialist out of London, England. Alyson, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me on. I'm really pleased to be here.
And we're excited to have you because I think every IP has gone through either a Legionella outbreak or a construction issue where it's like, this is already built. Now we just have to mitigate it. And I think that was one of the takeaways from our initial conversation was this conversation is bigger than just Legionella. It applies to design, construction, long-term care. So we're excited to dive into this.
Cool. I can talk forever, but I'll try and keep it brief.
No, it's a podcast, so this is perfect. So frame it up a little bit for us with your background, your experience, and what a built, for our U.S. audience, a built environment infection control specialist does.
So I am a bit of what they call a unicorn, I suppose, in a way, because this specialism is emerging and it's growing. And obviously, the more public awareness is around these issues, that's the more interest it becomes. However, I was doing it back in 2011 when no one really cared about it. Really, what I did was I obviously am a qualified registered nurse here in the UK, but I also have an engineering qualification that underpins my engineering and construction studies background, which I then brought into one of the first ever built environment roles. And what that means is basically I'm an infection control nurse who sat between the projects and construction teams, facilities teams, and IPC, the clinical teams, in order to bridge that gap of accountability and communication, really, on all elements of the built environment. within so bringing a clinical risk profile from an infection control perspective to the built environment. So when people were planning projects, or there was a new build hospital, or there was a refurbishment or an upgrade, or just the maintenance and repair stuff, which is, the bread and butter of every day, that sort of stuff wasn't the estates teams, the clinical team, the construction teams weren't aware of the clinical risk, and the clinical teams weren't aware of what the construction teams were doing. And so that was why this role was brought about, to kind of bridge that gap. And I've been doing that since 2011, and I've become sort of a bit of a specialist in that area.
So when we're talking about built environments, when we say that kind of term, we are talking about like a construction IP, basically.
Yeah,
right?
Somebody once said to me that in America, it's almost like an industrial engineer, which isn't, it's all terminology, isn't it? But it's kind of that sort of thing in terms of bridging. You've got public health engineers, but this is more of a patient focused. So in terms of primarily the question we ask is, what is the risk to the patient? And then we make that risk assessment based on that. So for an instance, if there's a water outbreak and we've got an increased patient isolates of gram-negative organisms, then we would then investigate the water systems and work alongside with the construction team and the clinical teams to do that. It's sort of bringing those two risk profiles together to get an overall holistic assessment for the patient.
Yeah,
to make
so interesting. It's like an industrial hygienist, but better. It's like an industrial hygienist merged with an infection preventionist to make like a super IP. I love it. I love this.
Should I take that as my moniker? Super IP.
Super.
You definitely should. Absolutely.
I jest. No, it is, but I think it's really, really needed. And I think now, if you know, in the UK, people are starting to bring these roles into their organizations because of just the impact of not being able to occupy a space safely, whether that be a long-term facility that they want to move around or a new build. And there's so many examples of new builds gone wrong and public inquiries that mean, talking with Gareth about the Duke University outbreak of NTM and the 2 patient fatalities associated with that. Well, we had 2 patient fatalities here in England associated with NTM as well, as a result of inhalation of water aerosols from a sink. And it was because, when you look to the coroner's inquest, it was because of poor management of the building during the operationalization of that building. So bringing the water system to life, they made mistakes. And when they fixed those mistakes, they created an unknown mistake in terms of the NTM took advantage of the dead bodies of the organisms that they killed off and throve in that environment, and therefore were subsequently found in the water. And they linked that organism in the patient. This is very rare to do, is to link the organism in the patient to the isolate of the tap. And so they knew that was the source of the infection. So they knew that they had acquired it in that building. And with NTM, that's quite difficult to achieve because usually they're quite slow growing and you can't tie the patient into the area. But with Legionella, that's an easier thing to do. But even then, we're not getting it right. And I was saying to Garrett, we've had all of this guidance out for Legionella since the 1970s, and we're still not getting it right. What hope really we need to be thinking about what we're going to be doing to get Legionella right, but also Pseudomonas, NTM, CPE, any of the other gram-negative organisms that decide to lurk in our water systems. So we can't stop these organisms. So we need to then think, how do we adapt the environment and manage the risk in the environment for the patients to be safe to come into them? And you've got to face it, really, is you've got to be pretty sick to get into a hospital bed these days. So if you're really, really sick, then, we need to protect you and not expose you to further risk, really. And that's my aim, really, is to be able to risk assess the environment and say, these are potential issues, even from concept, design stage, business case, planning, all the way through. I'll let you get word in interest.
No, that's perfect. And I think that should give people a lot of hope that there are specialized roles, and hopefully it becomes more common, where from your IP brain, you can talk about, well, if you kill the Legionella and the Pseudomonas, now that or that NTM has more resources to propagate. Whereas an engineer may think, all right, I've done A, B, and C, and we're in good shape. So it's the marriage of those two perspectives that makes this really powerful. And you brought up design and planning. And so when you're brought in, and I think IPs are often brought in too late, or they're kind of brought in after it's said and done, but you're brought in during the design and planning. And how does that affect the rollout and the risk for future patients?
So I think that there's lots of discussion about when infection prevention should be brought in. And usually people, as I said before, they don't really want to bring us in because they think we're going to cause problems. My argument has always been, actually, if you don't bring us in, then there's going to be problems. And I think we need to get in really big. In terms of the impact, it will prevent so much from happening. I mean, as I said, at the very beginning of the design phase, you've got the business case. In the UK, and I'm not sure about how it works in the US, but in the UK, they plan the resource allocation for all the ventilation for that building at business case stage. All the money that they need to allocate to actually deliver a ventilation strategy to that building is planned at business case. Why is IP not invited into those conversations and identify any potential risks? You know, how can you have you have a building that's planned for 18 air handling units because they're high risk patients, maybe they're cancer. And then value engineering comes in and they go, well, we can't really afford that, or we haven't got the footprint. We'll bring it down to this. But then that's going to have an ongoing impact when you try to bring that building to life at commissioning phase. And if the discussions weren't had at commissioning phase, how can you then translate that building into what you needed to deliver, which is a safe environment for patients? And I think the earlier, the better, even though there is a problem in education of IPC in this area. You know, we all know about surgical site surveillance, epidemiology. We're all taught about standardized infection prevention, clinical elements of the role. But in the UK anyway, certainly, they're not taught standardized infection control in the built environment. There's lots of global guidance, but it's all a bit piecemeal. So there's bits here and that are good, and there's bits there, and no one's really... I mean, if you look at the UK as an example, the HBN, which is the Health Building Note 0009, which is infection control in the built environment, was last written in 2013. It's a whole new world comparative to where we are now in terms of guidance. So the guidance doesn't keep up with the legislation, and the legislation doesn't keep up with the evidence. And we need the legislation to give us the authority to kind of go in and say, this is what we need to happen. This is what is the evidence base for this. So guidance and education, I think, are a real area of attention that needs attention for across the world. I'm not sure, but I think there's a lot of people have said the same.
I did want to go back to just the need for this type of position in facilities and just kind of correlate it with specialty positions that are kind of popping up in facilities, like there are OR IPs, SSI IPs, HLD IPs. You know, there's some specialty positions that are kind of popping up that are more like coordinators in the IP department for specific things. So I do feel like this might be something that really catches on, because this is a kind of big chunk of work for IPs. And I feel like this is something just kind of like SPD that you don't just learn a tiny bit about and get by. You really have to be an expert. And the way that you described it, that you're almost like an industrial hygienist, like what a great benefit it would be to an IP department, a facility, even a healthcare system to have an IP who even has extra certifications or extra credentials, extra things that they could do for these construction projects, or when there's mold consideration, you know, things like that. So I love the idea that this is kind of your place in the facility. And I think that folks in the US should maybe take note and consider this as a position.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot that I did that prevented a lot of things from happening and going wrong on the patient end. But it's only through, so I'll give you one of my favorite examples we get risk and method statements come through. So you'll get things from maintenance teams who say they're going to do something in a live clinical environment, and they'll give you this little list of things to do. At one episode we had, when I was working in a large teaching hospital over here, was they had done, it was an IT piece of work, and they had said about diamond drilling because it was part of their risk and method statement. And diamond drilling, to me, I understood it as needing to go through concrete because diamond tip drills are very hard. So they need to go through concrete. And this was in an immunocompromised patient area. So that was like, no, you can't do that. But if you didn't have that understanding, if you didn't have that knowledge to say, what does that actually translate into? What does the, how are you specifying this building? What does that actually translate into? Oh, we've got far too much water storage in this building. We'll never be able to turn it over. Therefore, we're going to cause a problem with stagnation. That stagnation leads to growth, and then we're going to have a problem. So how are we going to manage that? And how are we going to bring, one of the key things, lessons learned from Legionella outbreaks is that they haven't turned the building water systems over enough during the construction phase to then be able to give the building to be safe to occupy from a Legionella point of view. And all they tend to do a lot of the time now is stick point of use filters on the end of the taps, which is quite expensive and doesn't really interrogate your system and allow you to mitigate that risk or remove and eradicate that risk, because you can with Legionella to a certain degree. There's other organisms you can't, but still. There you go. You need to have that sets of knowledge, and it needs to be widespread that, you can interpret. I feel like I'm often a translator. I sit in the room, and especially being a woman, and I know I don't want to jump on that bandwagon, but being a woman, they just look at you and think you don't actually understand engineering terminology. And then you go, that plate heat exchanger, where are you going to put that? And, what is your air handling units? Specification, and what have you got, what your volumes are, etc. But being able to then say, but if you don't do that, you're going to cause damage and harm to people at the end of the operation, or you're going to have reputational damage. You're going to have financial constraints, contractual problems, and the list goes on. And, with net zero over here, some of the things have been to reduce down the circulating temperatures of water as a result of wanting to reduce down the energy usage. But from a clinical point of view, in my opinion, if you do that, you're going to cause problems with organic growth in the water system. So you've got to think, how safe is a building how net zero friendly is a building that you can't occupy because it's not safe. And it's a balance. You come to a compromise, but still you have to be able to have those intelligent led conversations.
I go back to the topic of stagnation, because this is something I feel like a lot of IPs don't think about. And it's not just your new builds, your new construction, it's your renovations, it's your small renovations. It's even when you have a unit, say you have a unit that, it doesn't get filled up all the time and you shut it down for a week and then you bring it back online. Are you thinking about that water that isn't being ran? We even had a bathroom that was never used in a certain part of our hospital until a surveyor went through and turned the water on. That's when all the things happen, and the water came out spurting and yellowish brown, and so all of those types of things are dealing with stagnation. So you have to always be thinking about that, and it's not just getting a new build ready. You should have that kind of unit ready checklist. So, when you're bringing a unit back online, but then, like I said, this bathroom, this was an active unit, active hospital. It's just this one particular bathroom was never used, and no one would have ever even thought about it. So stagnant water can be a huge problem.
It is. And we've come across it before in immunocompromised patients' rooms where they have an ensuite bathroom, but they are very, very sick and actually don't come out of bed. They don't tend to use the ensuite bathroom, but also in decant and enabling work. So if you're moving people around and you leave an area stagnant for a period of time, then you've got to understand how the building works. Building services are built for the building, and they're built at the time that the building is built for the services that are in that space. When you reconfigure that, you need to consider the building services alongside everything else. So people think about moving a service around a building. They think, right, we've got to move the catering, we've got to move the portering, we move the equipment, we move the patients. What about the building services? What has the water system been doing in the previous time before? Because you can't just move immunocompromised patients in if you haven't had a comprehensive water risk assessment completed for the area that you're moving into, because you need to know what you've got. But you also need to know that maybe it's an older part of the building and they don't have the schematics, so they're not sure what's there. What mitigations are you then going to put in place so that you can keep the patient safe? Because all the building is connected, right? And what was happening was patient spaces were being renovated, but the removal of the dead legs were not happening. And so what you should be doing is bringing it back to the risers so that you're actually taking all of those stagnant areas out, especially if you convert like a bathroom to a storage area, which happens quite a lot because bathrooms are used less and less. And actually what happens is you go in and you'll see a sink with 20 pillows stacked on top of it. Or you turn on the tap and it's brown, like you said, which is rusty pipes. Or you don't have any schematics and you don't know what's going on in the building in terms of its age, it's so old. It's been changed so many times and nobody's kept track. So you need to really, really be key risk assessing what it is you've got in terms of building services and the design and layout and how that's going to impact the service that you're putting into there. You can reconfigure rooms and spaces, but you need to be able to have that conversation at the very beginning. And it's hard because infection control doesn't always get told. And we, like you said, we know we get brought in at the back end. But at that point, I would be saying, I'm sometimes I get told off, but I would just be like, I'm sorry, I can't sign it off. I just can't, because it's my name and it's my professional reputation. And I don't want to be putting people at risk. And I have the evidence to back myself up. You don't have the information. You don't have the knowledge. You don't have the, evidence to say that this is a safe place to put patients and that this patient group is going to be safe here. Maybe we can work on a mitigation strategy, but that would take time. And we need to have those conversations now. Organizations are moving so fast and patient care spaces are so important that actually things that you need to support that environment are reduced down, like storage, cleaners. So that's what also plays into how an area is used and how water systems are affected, because people will put things no matter where they can put them. If they haven't got enough storage space in the original design, if that's value engineered down to a smaller space, that will then impact how the area is used. First question I always ask for any project is, how is the area going to be used and who's going to be there? If you can map that around your design and your building services layout around those two questions, then you'll probably end up with a compliant space rather than going, well, these are the regulations and this is what we have to build it to. That's fine, but we need to consider who's going to go in there and what the impact of that will be longer term, I suppose.
I think that you've hit on a really common experience for IPs where you're walking around and you're asking about potential dead legs or how are we changing this space. I remember one experience where the facilities manager, who was great, was walking around saying, this is this loop, this is where it comes off the riser, we have a drop here. And I just found myself thinking, well, what if we didn't have this person who had been there probably as long as the building? So what if tomorrow they retire? Is everybody else tuned in to what this plan is? And like you said, the schematic, is that kind of public knowledge? And that's one of the challenges that I think IPs hit when they're interacting with facilities, is you may not have enough information. They are kind of the source of truth for that information. That when, you'll send an email asking for where does this loop go for sampling? And you may not get a great response back, or as been your experience, you might be kind of dismissed. But I'm glad you're highlighting that we have to think of it in terms of how is this space going to be used, what patients are going to be impacted, and going beyond just it's built to code. It's got to be built safe for long term.
And we do it for fire, right? We do it for fire. We have compartmentalization. We have different strategies. We do it for fire. Why do we not do it for water and air? I'm not sure. I think, there have always been real problems around fire, and everyone's very, we've got the Building Safety Act over here that's been introduced as a result of Grenfell. But part of that responsibility means that now the organizations are responsible for making sure that the environments that they deliver are safe. And that I'm sorry, I argue very strongly includes water in our provision for that building, because that's a key element of where organic growth and organism by pathogenic organisms can be transmitted to patients and staff and visitors, etc. So and we have to understand what the evidence bases tell us. I mean, over here there's a big push for removal of clinical hand wash basins from the clinical space because of the risks that they pose. However, I think we need to be proportional in our response and understand that we need to balance the risks of hand hygiene compliance and removal of sinks. We still need to be able to wash our hands when they're visibly soiled. We still need the access to water, but that needs to be understood in the larger scale of when you're creating an area or you're doing a new hospital. Are you sizing the building appropriately for the outlets that you've got? Because if the push for removing outlets goes on, then what you've got to remember is you go back to the back of the building and you've got the water storage in the tank. That's quite that's specified for all of the outlets that were originally there. If you take them out, then you're going to have less water usage through the building. And so therefore you're going to get stagnation, you're going to get thermal transfer heat, you're going to get poor pressure, and then you're going to have all the problems that we talked about already.
Let me back up for just a second, just in case somebody that's listening doesn't understand what a dead leg is and why it's dangerous. Do you mind just explaining that for just a second?
Yeah, so essentially it's a length of pipe that goes nowhere. Often, and we call it a blind end sometimes, but it's essentially just a run of pipe that doesn't actually lead to an outlet. And so therefore you're not drawing it off out of that space. So it's almost like, it's like a pipe coming out of the pipe and it just sits there. And the water in there kind of sits there and goes in and out, but doesn't really. And so you get biofilm development in that dead leg, in that bit of pipe that isn't being pushed through, because it's the stagnation. Biofilms, we know that Legionella hides Pseudomonas in the biofilm and that they remain in a sessile state in that biofilm and they can protect themselves for quite a long time and then slough off and be delivered around the system. So even though you think it's not all connected, it's all connected, It's an important thing to remember from a water system. Your whole building is connected, whereas it's not quite the same with air, but there is an element of that as well, but more so with water.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, because that's, again, one of those translating pieces where biofilm does not stay put. It's going to circulate, it's going to detach, because that's the primary driver for bacteria is how do I get to as many places as possible with enough resources?
Yeah, it's nutrient rich, isn't it? And then people tip everything down the sink as well, like drugs and tea and coffee, and wash their soaps down the sinks, and so they're providing a nutrient source. I think I mentioned when I was chatting to you before, Gareth, about the moth flies. Jill, I'm not sure if you've heard about these. There were moth flies in an outbreak of CPE. So these moth flies came up the sink drain, had CPE on their feet. They flew around this clinical unit and caused an outbreak of CPE as a result of that transmission into the environment. So we do have a problem with how we keep our wastewater traps and wastewater separate from the patient. But I think if we manage our systems properly and we look at them holistically, then we've got a better chance of doing so. But it's an ongoing battle, because these organisms have been around a lot longer than we have, and they'll probably be around a lot longer than we are. So, they're fit to survive. They're built to survive, and they will persist.
Well, that story is literally what nightmares are made of. So thanks for that.
Sorry.
I was about to say, everybody listening is just like, wait a second, what? But that's the reality.
I'll share with you the paper. I'll send you the paper.
Okay.
It's not my paper, but the thing is, I think we have to be reasonable, right? We're never going to eradicate all of the risk. That's not going to happen. But we can identify and manage it where we can, and we can mitigate it where we can. And we can do things. There are things we can do, even in a new build or in a retrograde or an upscale retrofit to a place. We can do things to manage the risks, and I think that's what we should all be trying to do and achieve.
Alyson, as we round this out, what are some of your advice, tips, and tricks and quick go and do's for the IPs listening? How can they have a better, safer environment for the patient?
Walk your building. Know your building. Go to the plant room. Ask the questions. Find out what a plate heat exchanger is. Find out what a calorifier does. Find out how that risk is. I learned the most from just being in and listening to other people. I think there's a kind of, I don't want to say arrogance, but there's almost like a separation of I'm infection control. That's not my job. But actually it is. You need to understand how your building works in order to be able to risk assess it. You wouldn't do anything else without being able to, you wouldn't just walk in and go, I can do a fire risk assessment here, but I don't need to know how fire works. You need to understand how it works. So walk your building and try and get in the meetings and ask the questions. Put your hand up and say, I didn't understand what you meant there. Can you re-clarify what that actually means so that I can understand it? Because actually, if we do that on a regular basis, and I don't care, not a lot of people do that. They don't want to admit professionally that they don't know. But I think you have to be brave and say, I don't understand what that means. I just want you to go back and say, how does that translate into the water risk? We need to have multidisciplinary team water safety groups. We need to bring the different disciplines around the table on a regular basis, because if that discussion is not happening, then our water risk assessments are not happening and they're not adequate. So we need ventilation safety, water safety, probably waste safety, all of these different elements of the built environment. We need these groups that are involving things like the cleaning teams, the design teams, the projects, the architects, the engineers. All of them need to be in the same room. And it's hard because we're all very busy and, it's a hard, high throughput. The other thing is we need to have senior enough people to be able to make the decisions quickly. Because if you have a waterborne outbreak, you need a lot of financial resources to be made available to you to deal with that in terms of mitigating the risk to patients. So you need to have someone senior enough that can sign off on some of those decisions, not wait 2 weeks before the next meeting comes along to then, so it needs to be in real time, some of this stuff. And what you can do, and my good friend at Great Ormond Street has an operational water safety group, which is monitoring the routine and every day. And then there's a strategic water safety group, which is 2 levels, and it just allows that connection between the 2 organizations and hierarchies within the organization. So I think those are my takeaways.
That's excellent, and concrete things that we can go and do tomorrow. Alyson, we appreciate you sharing your expertise and really a unique perspective on IP that is definitely necessary. So we want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I have to say that was a lot of fun. I love the idea of having an IP that is just specializing in ensuring that these projects, construction projects, renovation, all of this is done correctly, because we know as IPs, this is a difficult job and is definitely a full-time job if you want everything to go correctly. And I love how she put that IPs are brought in too late to these projects. We all know that that is a pain point for all of us. And we understand that that is definitely something that needs to improve. And I love that conversation about the stagnant water. That is something that all IPs need to not only understand more, but start rounding on more, checking on more, not just in your construction projects, but in your areas of the hospital that may not be used as much.
It's 100% true. And this is the type of crucial conversation that IPs should hear and feel empowered to go and learn, to go and be experts. If you like construction, if you don't like construction, we had some great examples in this episode of where it really does impact patients in ways that we may or may not expect. So we're very grateful to Alyson for joining us on this one. And we'll put in a plug because if you do have water issues, she is a great and very helpful resource in tackling those. So we want to thank everybody for joining us. And remember, infection stops where information starts.
Thanks for tuning in to the Transmission Control Podcast, where infection stops because information starts. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know. Connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and share this episode with your team. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep transmission under control.